All right, so we are going to be continuing our discussion that we began last week. Remember, we're now in the morality section, so we're going through the various laws that God has, that they're not just arbitrary, but they're designed to help us better understand who we are, how God has made us, and how He's made us for happiness here on earth, but ultimately it's fulfillment of eternal happiness in heaven. And so we went through and looked at the Ten Commandments. We talked about the Beatitudes before that. Then last week we began going through the church's teaching in the area of sexuality, because that's often one that people have a struggle with today, and our society is really, very much confused in that area. So as we went through, we saw various. The church's response to it most recently has been formulated through the Theology of the Body that Pope John Paul II kind of reflected on and enumerated. And so we looked at a couple different principles. We used that image, to help us understand that, we go back to the way God created us from the beginning to understand the way that we're supposed to be. We looked at the various images of that love is supposed to be modeled after God's love, so it's free, total, faithful, and fruitful. So we can evaluate actions in that area. Does it fall under those things? Is it expressive of those characteristics of God's love? And if it fails in any of those areas, then it's going to, we'll understand why the church says that those are going to be immoral. We also looked in the terms of the language of the body, that our body speaks a specific language in the area of sexuality. Those actions are meant to speak a language, specifically the action within marriage of the husband and wife becoming the one flesh union is meant to express a renewal of their wedding vows. And so one could speak a truth or could speak a lie through what their bodies are doing. And so these are ways in which we can evaluate them. One other thing that we talked about too was we talked about love being the gift of oneself to another to put their good before your own. And so if love is willing the good for the other person before yourself, what then becomes the opposite of love? Do you remember what we said the opposite of love was? Use, right? Using the other person. In other words, I want to take from you rather than make myself a gift for your good, right? And so we can use those to evaluate the various things, whether they're true or not. So we started going through there. We talked about adultery. We found that failed to live up to free, total, faithful, fruitful love, as well as sex outside of marriage. It does as well. They're trying to renew their wedding vows even though they haven't made any yet. So we looked at various reasons why it's wrong. We also looked at, we started looking at the kind of how we've gotten to where we've gotten with the course to the way our society deals with various areas that stem from sexual issues. And so I argued that, we can see how as each area got breached, we kind of went further and further away from God's original vision of marriage. And so that was what I'm claiming. And so we're going through, we talked a little bit about no-fault divorce, which takes the permanence away from the unitive meaning of marriage. So that was kind of the first breach into, well, maybe we don't really have to follow exactly God's vision of marriage, right? Maybe it's okay to allow that. And then we talked about contraception last time, how that removes procreation from the sexual act and from marriage as well when it was started to be used within marriage. So we talked about how that changed. It used to be all Christian churches saw it as being wrong, and everyone thought that many Catholics also thought the Catholic Church would also follow the way of many of the other Christian churches that had allowed it as an exception for marriage, but the exception basically became the rule, especially after the pill becomes available in the 60s. So there were even some people within the Catholic Church, leaders, who would tell couples that they could go ahead and use it because it was perfectly fine, and the church was going to change and get with the times. But the church has not changed her teaching, and she cannot change her teaching because they're based off of the scriptural vision of what marriage is, right? We can't change what marriage is, so therefore we can't change the meaning of what sexuality is that God created us, so we can't change this either. So we went and talked about that quite a bit. I won't cover everything that we talked about, but just to remind us. Then we talked about natural family planning as respecting the way that God has created us, and so that is really tailored to every individual couple's situation. We have resources like the Pope Paul VI Institute. But of course, it may be still more difficult because it requires you to grow in greater virtue. So we looked at the difference, contraception versus natural family planning. Natural family planning it can be more difficult because it requires growth in virtue, and that is better for marriage in the long run. So I connected this with this quote from the Venerable Dr. Jerome Lejeune. So of these, we've talked about contraception first. He says contraception is to make love without a child. So now we're going to go through, we're going to look at each of these other ones. So stemming from contraception, we saw that the next step I have on here is abortion from contraception. That once contraception becomes widespread used, it is a natural progression that so would abortion, right? In fact, so let's see. He says abortion is to unmake the child, right? So we're trying to make love without a child, and if we try to do that and we accidentally have a child, so now we have to unmake the child as well. So, and this isn't something that I just made up, that abortion is backup contraception. This comes from the highest court of the land. So the Supreme Court in the case Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey in 1992 said, for 2 decades of economic and social development, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. So the Supreme Court has, in their rulings, said we have to keep abortion legal because people have determined their lives based around contraception, and if it fails, they need abortion. That was basically their part of their conclusion. And we would, in a sense, agree, the church would agree, is like, yes, we can see how this has happened, that people utilize abortion oftentimes as backup towards contraception, which also helps us understand, too, why the church would be against contraception, too, because if you understand what abortion is and how it's related and how contraception can often lead to it. It's a mentality, really, that's going on. So contraceptive mentality changes the way in which people think about children, right? That children are no longer thought of as a gift from God, but children are thought of as a burden. You know, fertility is thought of as a disease, and, you know, it's produced something that you did not want, right? And so it changes the way that people think about children overall. And we'll see that it will continue into the fertility industry as well when we talk about, we'll talk about in vitro fertilization in those areas. So what is the church teaching with regard to abortion? Most people would realize what the church's teaching is. Since the first century, the church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to the moral law, right? So and the reason why is because that is a human life, right? And it falls under the commandment, you shall not kill. We as human beings do not have authority over other human beings' lives, right? And so God is the one who determines life and death. We cannot take the life of an innocent human being, especially the most vulnerable. In any other case, even society would see that, the most vulnerable, when crimes are committed against the most vulnerable, those are the most heinous of crimes, right? And so that's the case also here for abortion. This image right here actually comes from the church where Pope John Paul II grew up, where he was a young boy. Later, they added these murals to the ceiling in the church, and there's several different murals, and they represent different encyclicals that Pope John Paul II wrote. And this one is Evangelium Vitae, which is on human life. And so you can see it also has the image of the massacre of the innocents. So that Herod killed the children in and around Bethlehem, trying to kill Jesus. So obviously it's an attack on human life that happened at the time of Herod as well. He saw children as being a danger to his power and authority, right? It's not too much different from today as well. People see that as a danger to their power, their authority, their vision of what their life is going to be. Abortion is so serious. It's one of the major issues that the church will often talk about because it happens in such great numbers today. And one practice of the church really points out just how serious it is to take the life of an unborn child, is that for those who obtain an abortion or for those who help somebody else obtain an abortion, that comes with an automatic excommunication from the church. So this applies to Catholics only. So in order to be excommunicated from the church, you actually have to be a member of the church, right? So what an excommunication is a legal penalty that points out the severity of a crime, right? So most sins don't have excommunications connected to them, but some do. Like, for example, if you try to attack the Pope, that has an excommunication attached to it. If as a priest I divulge information from the confessional, that has a penalty attached to it as well. And the penalty, it's not given there so you can't be forgiven, but it's given there so you recognize the gravity of what you've done and you seek forgiveness, and the penalty can be lifted, but it has to be lifted by certain authorities within the church, right? So in the Archdiocese of Omaha, the bishop has given all the priests the ability to remove that penalty. So in the past, when abortion wasn't very common, because it was so serious, usually it would be only the bishop who could lift that. But because it has unfortunately become so common, and because of other circumstances that, oftentimes women may be in a state of distress when they seek out abortion, we recognize the importance of being able to offer forgiveness for that without having to go further. So the Archdiocese of Omaha, the bishop is given the ability. Pope Francis actually, in the Year of Mercy, he extended it to all priests, and for that year, and because in the United States that's been given to all priests, but in other places where abortion wasn't as prevalent, that wasn't given to all priests because it wasn't really needed either. But at the end of the Year of Mercy, Pope Francis has extended it perpetually to all priests. So all priests have the ability to remove that excommunication. So like if somebody comes in and confesses it, I'm not even going to bring up the fact that it would have had an excommunication as part of it. We're going to forgive the sin. So it doesn't restrict, but it does help us to understand just how serious of a sin this is. You're taking another innocent human life.
So a priest can do it for just abortion, or does
So
communication sin have?
Yeah, so if they're for example, if somebody came to me and said that, I attacked the Pope, I couldn't remove that excommunication. I would have to, so it's all done in the internal form because I can't tell anybody about what happened in the confessional, right? But basically what I would do is I'd write the Apostolic Penitentiary in Rome saying that I have had a penitent who has confessed this sin, which has the ecclesiastical penalty attached to it, and I request that penalty, me to be given the ability to remove that penalty and forgive their sins, right? And so I'd have to write to them. They would respond and give me that ability to do that. In the meantime, the penitent, if they did that, I'm like, this is a very serious thing that has a penalty attached to it, and I cannot forgive that sin yet until I get authority to do that. So what I would like you to do is, let's say a month from now, I will come back to the confession, bring that sin up again, remind me that is who you are, that's what you're coming for, and by that time I will have received authority to be able to forgive that. But it points out, so it's not to deny them forgiveness, but that points out the severity of what they did, right? To ensure that they are truly sorry for that. Anyway, that's very few and far between.
But if you don't even bring up the excommunication about the abortion,
Yeah.
how do you just forgive the sin, but how do you approach that?
Well, I could evaluate because I can evaluate what sorrow, the sorrow for her sin. Because, if someone is coming and confessing this, they're probably going to be expressing deep sorrow for it. Because those who don't have deep sorrow for that don't show up to the confessional. Unless somebody would come and say, Father, I did this, and I know it's a sin, but I don't care. I'm not sorry. Well, it's like, well, I can't really forget. The chances of that happening are pretty slim, unless it's somebody purposely trying to, disrespect the sacrament by pretending like they're going to come and forgive it. But yeah. So most of the time, if somebody actually comes, it's because they do have sorrow for their sins. Right. So I'm not going to go into all the details here, but it's good to know there's different types of abortions that happen at different periods of time. If one potential resource, there is a website called abortionprocedures.com where you have a former abortion doctor has changed his life and turned away from that. So now he describes and teaches what is actually going on. Because sometimes there's a lot of euphemisms that are given out there with regard to abortion. We're terminating a pregnancy, and they don't really talk about what's actually happening. And so he actually, using graphics, but so it's about as clinical as you can get. But that's the thing, is like if people think that is disturbing, but yet they think abortion's okay, it's like, well, why is that disturbing them? If you're not ending a life, then it's basically the same thing as looking at a clinical explanation of some other surgery. Maybe because it actually is a human life and we're ending a human life. Because that's one of the things that when we want to talk to people about is to try to get them to face the most important answer as to what is the unborn? What is that? So there's various different kinds. I won't go into all those details. So since 1973, for almost 50 years, our country was under the decision of Roe versus Wade from the Supreme Court, which said that states cannot outlaw abortion in the first 2 trimesters. They could regulate, so prior to 24 weeks, they had no authority to regulate and say you can't have abortion in any way, shape, or form. They didn't have the ability to do that. After 24 weeks, then they could regulate certain aspects of the procedure for safety purposes. And states could also ban in the 3rd trimester as long as they allowed exception for health of the mother was the terminology. But at the same time, Roe versus Wade came out, so did Doe versus Bolton, which defined what is meant by health in Roe versus Wade. And it defined health, any physical, emotional, psychological, familiar, or related to the woman's age. Basically, health covers anything. So it effectively meant that abortion was legal for all 9 months of pregnancy. But in June of last year was the Supreme Court decision Dobbs versus Jackson, which overturned Roe versus Wade. It determined that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Right? There's nothing about abortion in the Constitution itself. This didn't mean that abortion is now eliminated here in our country. It basically meant that the question goes back to individual states. And so each individual state now has the ability to determine whatever laws they want to determine with regard to abortion. And of course that means that depends on where you're at. Some states are going to have many laws that are very hostile to unborn children, and other states are going to have ones that are not as much. Nebraska, prior to this, we're not going to go through all of these, but this was a list of some of the restrictions that Nebraska had in place that they had gotten through underneath Roe versus Wade, though there had been some other ones that had been fought against in that time. And so there's current legislation in the works right now where they're trying to enact more legislation for the protection of the unborn. Because in Nebraska, we don't have as many as certain states, but we still do have abortions that are going on here in Nebraska. So over time, the total number of abortions have gone down, praise the Lord, but the kind of abortions have transferred into what are called chemical or medical abortions. So these are the very earlier on in the pregnancy, when the child is in the first weeks of development, that the woman would take a pill containing basically a poison that's going to kill the baby. So that has to be done during the first trimester. They're up to up to 10 weeks is when the drugs have been approved. So more and more being done that way because it doesn't require surgery. It's easier, and the thing is that it's often more hidden, right? So it certainly is, still going on. So I've got a lot more that when I give a whole entire presentation on abortion, I go through a lot of science and stuff like that. But I just want to kind of just briefly hit on a few points. What do we do to end abortion? There's several things that we can do. The first thing that we want to do is we want to actually help women who feel like that's their only choice. Our society around us talks about having, women it's a woman's choice. But the thing is that women will often feel as though that's their only choice, right? That they have a choice as long as it's abortion. But we want to point out that you can choose to have your child, even if you're struggling with the many difficult things that you may be going on in your life, and you're not sure how a child is going to be able to fit in with this. So that's in our parishes. We've been talking a lot about walking with moms in need. And so that's really what that program, we have a group of individuals from our various parishes that have been getting together and talking through what kind of resources do we have in our area. And so then and are there any holes for the full helping women across the entire way? Some people when they well, pro-life people, you only care about life before it's born, and then once after it's born, then you don't do anything to help them. Well, that's really not accurate anyway, but we do many, many charitable things that assist after they're born as well. So we want to help, both mothers, fathers, and children. So helping in that way. Then there's the political action, too, that we want to continue to, with Roe versus Wade, when it was the law of the land, there was a lot of them that we went for marches out in Washington, D.C. to express the desire to change. Now the focus that's still important, countrywide, but two, also to make sure that we, what kind of laws are going through, in local areas, because we might think that, well, Nebraska is very, very pro-life. We drive and we see all these pro-life signs all over the place, but it still remains very, very difficult to get a lot of this legislation through at the state level. So I was amazed at how difficult it was just getting the pro-life license plate legislation to go through a few years ago. That was hard to make happen. We have something called the Nebraska Catholic Conference. If you want to keep up on what kind of political issues are related to the faith are going on, you can go to their website, and they have a lot of information about the kinds of things what kind of legislation that's going on, and how we should think about it as Catholics. So, and then the third thing, though, is even if we were to change, even though Roe versus Wade the law has been overturned, we still have abortion, and people are just as divided on it now as they were the day before it was still the law of the land. And so we need to help transform hearts. So it's a both and, change laws, but also be able to transform hearts with this. And so talking to people, people get in all sorts of arguments about different political things through social media, right? And we never get to any conclusions because it's really easy to yell at somebody that you can't actually see. But if you actually know who that person is and you see them face to face, and you engage in a conversation and you're civil with one another, you can actually get somewhere much greater. So there's actually resources like Abortion Dialogue Academy that will work with like high school, college age kids to help teach them, how do I engage in that? So they have a whole kind of walk them through, and how do we talk to people about that? One of the most important things I mentioned earlier, if we're going to go into conversation with people, is we want to try to redirect them to the most important question with this is, what are the unborn? Right. So this is with someone. I mean, if you're talking to somebody who, like a young woman who's considering abortion, you don't want to start necessarily with that, because research shows that she knows that her child is a child. She knows that's her child. Instead, you need to address her other needs and what she's struggling with, of why she thinks she has to choose between the death of who she thinks she's going to be versus the death of her child. That's literally what she's trying to decide between. Someone's going to die, and it will either be me or my child, and oftentimes it seems like, well, in order for me to survive, then because it's easier to see her life in front of her, what she's been dreaming of, rather than the child in her, even though she knows that that's a child. You can't see the child yet, and so you can push those thoughts away. But if you're talking to somebody else, then what we want to try to do is redirect them to answer the question, what are the unborn? Because if the unborn is not a human being, then abortion is just another medical procedure. Shouldn't be a big deal. But if it is a human being, then we have to ask what it is that we can or can't do to a human being, right? Can we actually end the life of a human being? Right, so that's the most important thing. So what we can often, because people will bring up all sorts of reasons why you have to have abortion that aren't necessarily related directly to what the unborn are, but we can redirect them to that. So we can redirect people to the main issue. I'm not going to go through a lot of details here, but we can ask questions. Why do you think abortion should be legal through all 9 months? Or why do you think abortion should be legal earlier but not later? Or try to find something you can agree with another person. That's a really good thing whenever you're trying to end a discussion. Find something that you can have some kind of common ground, but then also challenge them, but don't be proud about it. Don't try to beat them over the head with it, but to be humble when you're doing that. And one way in which you can redirect them is an argument called a trot out a toddler argument. So, in other words, if you take the reason why they say we need to have abortion and try to use it to justify killing a 2-year-old, right? So, imagine I have a 2-year-old here, right? So let's say they're like, well, we need to have abortion because what if the woman is in poverty and she won't be able to take care of the child, right? She needs to be able to, have abortion so that she won't have to raise the child in poverty. Well, what if this woman has a 2-year-old, right? Should she be able to, and she's in poverty? If she has a 2-year-old, should she be able to end the life of the child just because that child's going to be raised in a life of poverty, right? So you're redirecting, so you wait for them to respond and ask why. Well, why would it be wrong to end that life of the 2-year-old, right? Hopefully they would say it's wrong. If they don't say it's wrong, I'm not sure how much common ground we're going to be able to find. And, if they think, killing, a toddler is okay. So then we can find, so that's the issue, right? The issue is, well, because that's an actual child, right? They see the 2-year-old as being a child, whereas they didn't see the unborn as being a child. So that's the issue. It's not about poverty. It's about whether or not it is a child. It's a human being or not, right? And so then we've redirected them. So let's talk about it. What do we know about the unborn, right? So in all sorts of different arguments, the right to choose, the age or health of the mothers, child abuse, all these kinds of different things, we can redirect them. Well, would those things justify killing a child after they're born, right? And if it wouldn't, well, then what's the difference between those two? So, anyway, that's a very short, brief way, because when it comes to those that are unborn, and I haven't shown any of the science to back this up, but we can know 3 things about the unborn. We know that they're alive because they're taking in nutrients, they're growing through cellular reproduction. We know they're human because they have human DNA, they're offspring of human beings. They're not dogs or cats or any other things. They're humans because it's their offspring, and they're full organisms. They're not just like they're not body cells. They're not individual cells, but they're a complete organism, right? So they're not. That's some people will say, well, it's just a bunch of tissue. Not really. Scientifically, it's not. Scientifically, it actually is a complete organism. So there's more that we could go into that, but once you talk about and And many people, even those that are for abortion, will admit that, yes, I know it is killing a child. In fact, there was a comedian just recently who gave a show, and he was talking about and joking about this fact. That's like, yep, when we go to the abortion clinic, we expect a dead baby. That's what we're paying for. Right? It's like it was being very brutal, but it's like hopefully gets people to think about, yeah, that's what's happening when you're doing that. But then there's the philosophical question after that is, well, when does it have value? Right? When does if it is a human being, when does that human being have value? Because, if it doesn't have value, then maybe you could do whatever you want with it, right? So this is the question that pro-life people would ask other people with this. Shouldn't we treat all human organisms or human beings equally regardless of the level of development they're currently at? Regardless of how able-bodied they are or mentally developed, regardless of age, sex, race, or any other factor, shouldn't they all be treated equally and have a basic right to live? So that's what the pro-life stance is that regardless of whatever kind of specific characteristics they might have, they should all have the equal right to live, right? And so if somebody says no, well, then they've got to provide the justification for why certain human beings should be disqualified. Why should the unborn specifically be disqualified if they're a human being? Because if they do that, they very quickly get themselves into a very dangerous area, because every time in history when people have attempted to do this, when they've attempted to disqualify certain groups of human beings for various reasons, there has been all sorts of violations on the dignity of human life, right? Things like slavery, things like the Holocaust, right? They tried to justify saying certain groups of people can be disqualified from having this basic right to live, right? To have basic dignity. And this is the same thing that happens to the unborn. In the unborn, they might give certain differences between the unborn and the born to claim why the born should be protected and the unborn shouldn't, right? So the main differences between an unborn child and the born child are size, level of development, environment, and dependency. So if they bring up any of these are the most common ones that they might bring up. And if they bring them up, we can affirm that, yes, you're right, there is a difference, but ask why that would disqualify someone from being a person. And then show them that it has nothing to do with being a person, because you can make that differentiation between different born human beings, not just between unborn and born. So like, for example, that human value isn't dependent upon any of those characteristics, any of those factors. So if you think about size, right? Of course the unborn are smaller. We don't deny that. We know that they're smaller, right? But why does that matter? Why does that suddenly say someone has less worth just because they're smaller? Newborns are much smaller than that, and premature infants are even smaller. But that doesn't mean that that they're worth less, tall people are worth more than short people. Why does size have any matter there? Level of development. Yes, we are aware that the unborn can't function in the same way as a born child or as an adult can, right? They can't think and feel in the same way. They don't understand things in the same way. But newborn infants can't either. They can't function like an adults, but that doesn't mean that they're not a human person just because of that, right? Environment. The unborn can't survive outside the womb, so they'll say, well, that's why they're dependent. But how can moving from in the womb to out of the womb suddenly bestow upon them human dignity, right? Because it's not as though you have more dignity when you're at home versus when you're at work, Maybe you feel like people aren't treating you the same, but you still retain the same kind of dignity. I'm going to skip over that. Dependency. Unborn, of course, yes, they're certainly dependent upon their mother's body, right? Otherwise, they can't survive. But so are newborn infants. They're outside the womb. I mean, if the mother just left them there without caring for them, they would not survive either. So why does dependency, and we consider that crimes against children are the worst, right? So they're more horrific because they're dependent, right? So once again, none of these characteristics are things that would exclude someone from having worth, because we don't exclude born human beings from having worth just because of those reasons either. So it's a very, very quick way. If you want, I had put up the, let's see, the book earlier. If you want a good read for how to talk to people about abortion, this book called Persuasive Pro-Life by Trent Horton is a really good resource, and he kind of walks you through like various ways to talk to people about that.
So what happens if like the baby hasn't developed and it's not going to live past a couple hours after it's born?
After it's born, I mean, that's just like any human being that dies, right? We all know we will die, and so it's tragic if the child dies, right? But it wouldn't justify one killing it earlier, right? I mean, we will all die, but that doesn't justify someone to go start murdering people just because everybody's going to die, you know? So, and this is even the case, too, in which, let's say it's a, you know, sometimes people will say, well, we need abortion because of those special cases in which it's to save the life of the mother. The reality is that you don't use abortion to save the life of a mother because it takes too long. I mean, because normally when that happens, it's because the child is much longer in its term, and so you have to go through surgery, and so you got to prep her for surgery and everything like that, and that takes time. But if she's truly in danger of death, you don't do abortion. What you do is you facilitate the delivery of the child. You know, the child may or may not survive because they may not be developed far enough along, but you know, earlier and earlier now, because of our science, you know, depending upon where they're living in the world, you know, if they're living where there's places where you know, some places they're not going to be able to save the child because they don't have that technology. And other places, the child may survive. But you're giving the child a chance instead of just saying we're going to purposely kill it. You know, so there really is no cases in which abortion is required to save the life, and in fact, it would take too long and put them in greater danger if you went that way. But yeah, so we're not saying that, you know, in every case, in those cases, that the child is going to, well, we know that they'll be able to survive, but at least, you know, there's a difference between purposely attacking the child versus trying to assist the health of both the mother and the child as best as we can with the limitations that our medical science has. So I don't know if that kind of helped in that area. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So that's what it means to be pro-life. That all human beings are equally valuable, so we protect them as much as we can. So that's why abortion is to unmake a child that is already there, right? All right. So we talked about contraception, abortion. I want to talk about pornography just briefly as well. He says pornography is to unmake love. Remember, love is to will the good of the other person before yourself. So he's saying pornography is the opposite of willing the good for another person before yourself. So with pornography, these are statistics that are a few years old, so they may be up.
It's gone down, right?
I highly doubt that, but yeah. So pornography is also a huge scourge in the land, just like abortion is, and even to the point in which many states, and there might be more than this. This was the list in 2020. Yes, in 2017, 6 states had declared pornography to be a public health crisis, and then by 2020, 3 years later, 16 states had declared that. So there might be other ones since 2007 or since 2020, but I haven't had a chance to. It's a lot of work keeping up on all the statistics and a lot of these things because things keep changing. So,
Along with everything else.
yeah. So I haven't had a chance to update a lot of my slides. So
after they recognize that, anything that they're doing in those
yes,
states?
yes. So well, I don't know specifically in the states themselves, but for example, even outside of the church in secular areas, they have recognized, you know, these difficult that it's not good for people, right? And so, for example, here's one secular resource. This isn't connected to Catholic or Christian, you know, organization at all. It's called Fight the New Drug. So they call pornography as the new drug because they recognize how pornography affects us in different ways. It affects someone's brain. It triggers the release of natural chemicals within the body, dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, oxytocin. These natural chemicals that the body needs for various things, but it regulates in certain ways. So just like when somebody uses hard drugs, you're introducing a bunch of foreign chemicals that overloads the system, and you get some kind of high that the body then can grow a dependency on, right? Similar thing happens with pornography, is that pornography causes a higher doses of these natural chemicals to be released, and so the person gets a high within them, and then that high once the brain is overloaded, it gets used to this high, and so then it can also become dependent upon it, and so people can become addicted to the use of pornography because it has that kind of high. It also in there also, so that's with specifically the brain. So our brain can be, the good news is that if our brain can be wired improperly, it can also be rewired properly again, right? So there is malleability within the brain, but it can be difficult. It may take time, just like any kind of addictive things. You know, if someone's, you know, struggling with alcoholism, or they're trying to go through rehab for drugs, I mean, it's not easy. Similar kind of thing. It can take time. Pornography also affects relationships. It's, you know, in a sense, replacing real relationships with fake ones. And oftentimes these fake relationships are these brushed over, you know, perfect fantasy images, and they don't match actual real life. So if somebody is focused on some kind of fantasy with fake individuals, then they're dissatisfied. They're unable to enter into actual real relationships with real people that, you know, are not the fake things that they're taking in through the images and so one great line that they have on their website that I like is, don't give your heart to something without a pulse. All right, because that's really what's happening with pornography. You're giving yourself away to something that can't give itself back to you, right? And ultimately it becomes all taking. You're using other people. So, you know, the men and women who are in the pornography industry, they're being used as objects for others' pleasure, right? And I don't have it as part of this presentation, but I do show some examples of some individuals who used to be in that industry and got out, and they share some of their stories and how it destroyed them during that time, and how, you know, that they had to, you know, be drawn out of it. And finally, you know, pornography affects society. So if it's as prevalent as we saw those statistics earlier, right, that it's so prevalent, I mean, if there's billions and billions of people that are doing selfish acts versus doing self-giving acts, that affects society overall, right? Because many little selfish acts leads to a lot more selfish of a society overall. So there's a cycle of shame. Not only is it addictive on a chemical basis, but there's also a kind of cycle of shame with addictions, including pornography. So someone experiences some kind of stressor or something that triggers them to the bad habit, to the addictive habit like pornography. Then because they're feeling awful because of or stressed or whatever is going on, and then so they try to escape it through this high. But then they crash down from the high and feel the guilt and remorse because they know it's bad. They hate themselves for it. This is really what the enemy loves to do with our sins, is he tempts us to do something, and then he will mercilessly beat us over the head for having done it, right? He'll say it's no big deal, and then you do it, and then he's like, you are the worst. God could never love you again. You know, you might as well just do it again because, you know, it's too late now. So there's that guilt and remorse. We vow we're going to change. We're never going to do it again. But then that stressor hits, and that addictive kind of nature brings one back. And so people can get caught up in this cycle. And unfortunately with pornography too, because of its prevalence, and we saw that, you know, children are exposed to it younger and younger now because of its prevalence on the internet. And now we've got phones, and, you know, people have the internet at every waking hour in their life now, is that they can be exposed to it when they're young, and they can get trapped in the cycle and can be difficult to get out of it. So that's why it is important to be able to talk to children at the appropriate time, as to be able to, because you want to do as much as you can, obviously, to prevent them from being exposed to it. But we live in a world where it's everywhere, and so you want to make sure that they know how to be able to recognize what do you do when you see it. So there's actually some good materials. I won't play the video here, but 3 simple steps. Name what it is. That's a bad picture. That's pornography. Teach them there's good pictures, there's bad pictures. That's a bad picture. It's pornography. Turn it off or turn away, right? Turn away from it, right? And then tell mom or dad or someone you trust, right, about it. And mom and dad should know that, like, okay, don't get upset and scold them and be like, you're the worst because you looked at this. It's like, well, oftentimes they don't even know what's going on, and they have this. There's this, because God has created us with a conscience. We know that it's wrong, but there's also the curiosity because of the chemicals that are being released, through that kind of high that it causes. And so there's this conflict within, and so we need to teach them to be able to sort through. Children don't know how to sort through the different experiences that they're having, and they don't know what's going on. And so the pornography plays on that, right? So we want to be able to know how to do that. Here's one book, a resource, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, for parents can utilize for helping, how do I talk to my children about that and help to be able to protect them so they don't get pulled into something. It's a good question. I would say that parents should read it first. You should read it yourself and then determine, like, okay, how to what, knowing my child specifically, how would I apply, whether it's, because some pages in this book are for parents only, and other pages could be utilized with a child, to help teach them there, or the parent could do it kind of on their own too, based upon the book. So I would say, I don't know for sure the specific ages that are intended. I'd have to look and see. It probably says it in the book. I have a copy of it. I can bring it sometime too if you want to see it.
Like with our Circle of Grace stuff with the kids and stuff, if something like that.
Yeah. The kids are going to be, unfortunately,
It's
yeah.
ridiculous.
So, but ultimately it's something that, the parents should be involved with being able to talk to them, because they have the first responsibility to talk about those things, but we can assist them as a school, and so that's why I bring it up, because it's like because it is so prevalent and people get caught up in it, and it become, I sit in the confessional, I hear people's confessions, so I know that it's very prevalent. So.
And you guys are just starting.
Yeah. Another version of it that we also have to be wary of is this newer version of pornography, which is now it's not only other people making pornography, but it's individuals making their own pornography, because you're being asked to send pictures of yourself and things like that. So they make their own pornography. Of course, there's also potential issues there when you're dealing with minors that may not know that there are laws that this is connected to. So anyway, that's become more. And these are old statistics again. So just from 14 to 15, sexting went from the 13th biggest problem all the way up to the 6th biggest problem. So, for children's
2% of teens.
yeah,
Oh my gosh.
yeah. One of the things that they don't always know is that whatever you put up there on the internet, regardless of what you're using, you might think, I don't know how prevalent Snapchat still is, but because these things come and go. I should probably change this to TikTok, and whatever the next new thing is, I don't know, that I probably don't even know about yet.
I'm gonna say Snapchat is like,
Yeah.
it goes away after so long.
That's what they
but
claim.
The person can take a picture.
Yes,
before it
that's
goes
why
away.
if you ever send whatever you put on the internet, you should assume it will always be there. Yeah. So this is this young lady who's I'm quoting there is someone who found that out the hard way, right? She's like, I made a stupid mistake when I was younger, and it's never going away. and there's nothing I can do about it, because now you've got all these sites that, pull in everybody's whatever they find, and it will forever be out there.
I mean, the junior high kids, I think the parents have done a good job, because they're very much aware of it, that
Mhm.
this kind of stuff, they talk about it, and about it not being a good thing, and
Good,
how
good.
bad it is and stuff. I mean, they do talk quite a bit about it, so.
So it's important to know that one can achieve freedom if one struggles with it. It's going to take it's going to take prayer. It's going to take being accountable, to being able to have somebody that you can trust to be like, okay, I'm struggling with things, and to help me out. So it doesn't mean you have to tell everybody you're struggling with something, but, to help assist. Some people, you may need counseling to educate yourself on how to, what it actually does. And perseverance is a big thing. I won't play this video, but Matt Fradd, he's a Catholic speaker. He'll talk about pornography as one of the topics that he'll talk about. And in this little clip, it's just, all it is like, it's like, because there's this cycle of shame, and this kind of sin and other sins can really beat us down and try to get us to feel like we're worthless. He points out the fact is like, evidently, God really likes you. He likes you so much that he sent his son to die for you, right? So just give up and admit that he really loves you, right? And turn yourself over to him, and in those areas that we can't do on our own, right? But that's what sin will do to us, is beat us down and convince us that we're worthless. All right. Purity, though, is not so much a destination as it is a daily choice, right? We're choosing every day to follow the Lord. And that's a little bit more doable than someone who struggles with sin and thinking about, okay, to give up that sin for the rest of my life. Well, okay, how about just for the next 10 minutes? Let's say no to it. Let's say no for the next hour, right? When someone might be really struggling with sin. So pornography is to unmake love. And so we're going to look next at the last of these four that he has here, is that artificial fertilization is to make a child without making love, right? So this is the opposite of contraception, is to make love without a child. Artificial contraception is to make a child without making love. So each of these at the end here are incompatible with natural law. So each of these don't follow with the way God has created us, right? So that's actually our next one on here. So we go from abortion to the fertility industry today. It was kind of the next big thing. So that removes the union of the spouses, the becoming one flesh, the one flesh union in marriage, from procreation, right? Because you've already done that. You've removed you've removed procreation already from the one flesh union. So why not do it the other way around? Remove children from the one flesh union, right? And so that's what they do in the fertility industry with regard to in vitro fertilization. So some people will look at this and they will have a hard time understanding why the church would be against, using some kind of scientific methods to be able to achieve having a child, because they look at the suffering that a couple may have when they struggle with infertility, and many couples struggle for infertility. And so someone may be even very altruistic and want to alleviate their suffering, so why should they not be able to use these scientific means that we've been able to come up with, right? And it certainly is suffering. We see this in the Old Testament. I mean, many of the individuals in the Old Testament suffered greatly because they couldn't have children, right? Here's Rachel, right? She hadn't given Jacob any children. Give me children or I shall die. So yeah, it's real suffering. We know. I mean, we're not denying that. The church doesn't deny that they're going through suffering. But there's a principle having to do with the means and the end. In order for any action to be moral, both the end, the purpose, the final goal, the end, that has to be moral, as well as the means to get there. So the path, the way you're getting there, the method you're using. So both the means and the end have to be moral, right? So the end here is to try to alleviate the suffering of infertility, right? That's okay. That's good. That's moral. But the means that are being proposed to get to that end, in vitro fertilization, is not moral. So that's why you can't use it. So it is legitimate and praiseworthy to find ways to overcome infertility, but those means have to be morally acceptable. In the Catholic Church, we reject this principle that sometimes is given, that the end justifies the means. No, it does not. That is not a Christian principle, and the Church rejects that. Just because the end is good doesn't mean you can do whatever means you want to get to that end. Right? Give an example of this from the Scriptures. Right? So there are limits to the methods, to the means to conceive a child. So, for example, we find various immoral ways in which people try to and did at times conceive children. Right? So with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, right? Abraham and Sarah, they were unable to have children. And so it was suggested to Abraham, go have a child with the maidservant Hagar, right? And that caused all sorts of troubles and strife within the family, right? So that was not a moral way in which to do this. God made it very clear to Abraham afterwards. It's like, this was not what I meant when I said that you guys were going to have a son, right? And same thing with Jacob and Rachel. So Jacob ends up having, so if you remember, Jacob first is tricked by his uncle Laban to marry Leah. And so then, but he wanted to marry Rachel instead. So he ends up marrying both Leah and Rachel. And so he ends up having children with Leah. And so then Rachel's jealous because she doesn't have any children. So she gives one of the maidservants to Jacob to have a child for her on her behalf. And then Leah then doesn't want to be outdone. So then she gives her maidservant to Jacob, and then he has children with theirs. And that's, so the 12 sons that they have are from 4 different women, right? Once again, this was not, God will use it to further his plan of salvation, but this is not the way in which, marriage ought to be done. And then to another very clear case is with Noah's daughters. So after the flood, I don't know if this is not a story we usually read when you're reading the Bible stories in the Old Testament. But so if you're not aware of this one, so after the flood, there's not a lot of eligible men on the earth after the flood, right? They've all died, and so Noah's daughters want to have children, and so they decide to try to have children with their father. So they get him drunk and attempt to have children from their father, right? Very clearly a means that is not moral, right? Maybe a good desire to want to have children, but that is an immoral means. So it just very clearly shows that, just any means that we come up with to get to a good end doesn't automatically make it good. So this is the case with in vitro fertilization and other things too. So one thing to point out, that creating a child, just because a child comes into existence, doesn't make an immoral action moral, right? Children are good. They're a gift from God. But it doesn't, if you're doing it through an immoral means, it doesn't suddenly make that immoral means moral, right? So conceiving a child through rape, for example, the child is good and has dignity, right? But it didn't make the rape moral, right? It didn't suddenly make it okay. Same thing with in vitro fertilization. It's not sufficient to make that action moral. Of course, the other way around is important to mention too, is that once the child is conceived, once the child exists, even if it was done through immoral means, it doesn't make the child less valuable just because the means of their conception was immoral, right? So that's very important. So once a child is conceived, if they're conceived out of rape, if they're conceived from in vitro fertilization, neither of which are good means, the child still has worth and dignity equal to that of any human being, right? Because they're a child of God. So, make sense? Okay. So if we look at, I've said that in vitro fertilization is not good. Well, why is it not good? Well, we can look at it from, I'll try not to go into too great details because there's a lot of, on every single step of the way, there's something wrong with it, right? So when you're obtaining the gametes from the woman, in order to obtain the eggs, the means to do that is immoral. So here's the act of harvesting eggs from a woman, whether for herself or to donate for the use of other couples or for research, is itself immoral, for it constitutes the first step in a process that ignores the sacredness of human life, treating children as products to be purchased, right? So you're treating, the only use of harvesting eggs is to treat a child as an object. So what the mentality that we find behind behind this area is very much this: children are a commodity, right? I want to have a child. Well, we don't have couples have a right to be open to each other to be able to have a child, but it doesn't mean we will, right? It may not be part of God's plan for that family. They may not end up not having a child, right? But you can't say, well, I can do whatever I want to ensure that I have it, because suddenly you're thinking in a different way. The child's no longer a gift. The child is now, we deserve to have it. We're entitled to having a child, right? So there's nothing moral that can be done with that. Same thing with men too. The means for obtaining the sperm is also immoral, because the deliberate stimulation of sexual organs outside of the loving act between husband and wife is also gravely immoral, right? So another thing that this does too is both egg and sperm donation can separate the child from their parent, right? Because the one who donated, that's still their parent. But now you have purposely separated that child from their parent. This will come up more in another area too, where this isn't good. So there's a couple. I won't not play any of these videos, but there's some like documentaries that talk about exploitation, which is all about how the industry exploits young women, and there's a very dangerous process of harvesting eggs, and they don't tell them. They entice them with money to get them to donate their eggs, and don't tell them sometimes at best, it's they may end up being sterile, and other times it could be worse than that. For this one, Anonymous Father's Day. So, if you think about it, there are individuals out there who do not know, because of this process, they don't know who their parents are. Like, I know my father was donor number whatever, and that's all I know about. And in other words, people are, so just think about it, knowing where you have come from, knowing what is in your history and who you've come from, but then not being able to know that. It could even have medical consequences, right? How do you know that, you want to get married to this person, but you have no idea? Maybe you're actually related to them, Neither of you know your parents, because all this was involved, right? How do you know? Maybe you didn't know that there was some kind of genetic issue that your parent had, but you don't have any of that information. That was not passed on to you. Genetic diseases or something like that could be passed on. All right. So want to be clear is it's not so much that the church is against technology, though. The church is not saying that all technology is bad, that you can't use any new technology or anything like that. No, using technology is not wrong in itself, but it's how the technology is used. And here's the rule of thumb in the area of these kind of fertility. It's moral if a given medical intervention helps or assists the married act to achieve pregnancy, right? So if something's being utilized to help the couple with the marriage act to be able to achieve a pregnancy, then that's moral. So like, for example, the NAPRO technology from the Pope Paul VI Institute. They help evaluate what may be going wrong with fertility for the couple and try to evaluate, can we fix that in some way so that there's a better chance to be able to achieve a pregnancy. Versus the immoral means is if the intervention replaces the marriage act with something else in order to engender life, right? Which is what in vitro fertilization ends up doing. It replaces marriage act with something else. You've got a third party that gets in the middle. No one else should be able to come into the sacredness of husband and wife becoming one and the life of the child. And the child deserves to be brought forth into the world from the expression of love between their parents. So surrogacy too will fall under this this main reason why surrogacy ends up being immoral, because it replaces the marriage act rather than assisting the marriage act. So we've already talked about the sacredness of marriage when we talked about the sacrament of marriage. There's the two ends, unitive and procreative, and as we've been going through neither of these two things can't be separated from each other, because we're imitating the very love of God himself. So we can't separate those two. Where contraception is the union without the procreative, and IVF now is trying to do the procreative without the unitive. So you can't separate those two. Another issue with the in vitro fertilization process is that in order to make the process work, they have to utilize multiple embryos. So they'll harvest, the gametes from the mother and father outside of the womb. They'll try to conceive the child, produce the embryos, and then the embryos will be implanted back into the mother. But they do this with multiple embryos, right? So they're trying to have a child, one life. So to do that, they produce many lives to ensure that at least one can survive. The ones that are that show the greatest promise are then implanted. The others are either discarded or left in a frozen state. But every single one of those embryos is a human life, right? We can't do those things to a human life. So IVF is intentionally destroying life to bring other life into the world, right? And that we are not allowed to do. So it's very gravely immoral to do that. Another step of this is that oftentimes what they'll do is they'll implant not just one of the embryos, but multiple of the embryos to try to ensure that at least one will implant successfully. And the others that don't, they're expelled. They'll die, basically an abortion. But also they'll talk about if, let's say, they've had to implant 5 embryos, right? And all of them happen to implant, and they all start growing, right? But they didn't want 5 children. They just wanted 1, right? And so they may suggest them to selectively reduce the number of children that they have, right? More euphemisms as to they want to abort them. That's what they're going to do, right? So, and once again, this lends to this kind of like, in a sense, designer babies, in a sense. Well, which child are we going to choose? We'll call these of our children, but because we want this one. We think this is the one that we're going to have. Has what the right characteristics that we want, maybe. So, let's skip over the video parts here. What about the unused embryos that are kept frozen? They might be used later by the couple or by other couples or for research. But the church says that any of these three things, once again, it constitutes an immoral choice, right? So the church says that the unborn human persons are exposed to an absurd fate with no possibility of their being offered safe means of survival which can be licitly pursued. In other words, any choice that a person you've chosen to commit a grave sin by utilizing this method to create human life apart from the union of the spouses, and so now you have these human lives there. Whatever course you take from that point on, any of those paths also will remain immoral, will not be a moral path. So it points out that just how grave this process is that, oftentimes when we commit a sin, it will oftentimes lead us to other sins, right? So let's say, you lie about something. Well, you end up having to lie again to cover it up, and you lie again to cover it up, right? You're not being forced to do that, but often you do that. But in this case, the only way out is through a path that ultimately will not uphold the dignity of the life of that child in some way or another. So, so it's difficult, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, I've had couples that have come to me, and they didn't know that this is they weren't told. They didn't realize. Well, either they weren't told or they didn't realize that was what was going to happen. That they were going to have children left frozen until later they realized that this is what's going on.
So what does the church instruct in those cases?
Yeah, it's difficult. She doesn't have a specific one. She's. I mean, that's why we point out the fact that how gravely immoral this is because it doesn't leave a moral path out. You have to commit another immoral act in order to get out, right? And she can't condone committing another moral act. So it does. That's what's like. Yeah, it shouldn't be pursued from the very beginning. It doesn't mean that somebody who goes through this can't be ever forgiven for what they've done. I mean, the church isn't going to say that, but she does. I mean, she has to seriously warn of what this can lead, what kind of a place this could lead someone to.
So that is not like a sin of excommunication.
No, well, I mean, the church hasn't specifically added IVF to that list or anything like that.
But
But
if you have some that are frozen and you choose not to, then
if you just choose to just keep them frozen, eventually they'll die. That doesn't uphold the dignity of that child, just to let them do that. You can't just unthaw them all and let them die. That doesn't uphold their dignity. You're basically killing them. To use them for research, to let them be, that is immoral.
wouldn't
To
that
do
just be
research.
considered like abortion with all of that then?
Yeah, I mean, abortion's involved with all that. Yeah. To donate them out so that other couples could have them. That is also an immoral action because of the separation. Because you've already started the immoral action. It basically is bringing the immoral action to completion, right? You've already separated the child. The dignity of a human child deserves to be born from the union of husband and wife and to be born of their parents, right? And not to purposely separate them from the parents that have conceived them. So there's always this. I mean, one could potentially say like, well, maybe that's the least of the worst, of the options. But the church still can't say that, even if one sin is less than another sin, you can't say that it's not a sin.
It's still a sin.
Yeah.
But if they were still to be using those eggs, to go back.
Yeah, but
keep
you're
them
still
alive.
you're still not treating them with the proper dignity. You're still not treating them with proper dignity. So
No.
yeah, that's why the church is like, this should be avoided from the beginning. Ultimately, and surrogacy is related to that. So to what we're just talking about there. So a surrogate woman agrees to bear the child for another person or persons who become their parents. But this is against the dignity not only of it's against the dignity of everybody involved, really, because you're using the other woman as a means, you're not treating them as a person, you're treating them as an object. I mean, they're when people utilize this, they don't even think of the surrogate mother as a mother, really. They're only part of that child's life for that very short amount of time, and then they're taken away. Children are treated as products, right? I don't want to have to go because sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to do all the time with like health issues. It has to do with like lifestyle choices, right? I don't want to have to go through it myself, so I'll have somebody else carry the child. That way I can maintain my movie star physique or whatever. So once again, children are being treated as products. They're not being treated as a gift from God. And the videos you can hear testimonies of the women who become surrogates, and oftentimes they'll do it for altruistic purposes. They think they're doing something good for helping people with infertility, but then they find out the horrors that can arise. Doesn't mean that every time there are bad things that always necessarily happen, but oftentimes they can. And well, the struggle too that they find too with like the bond that they form with this child that grows within them that is then ripped away, or the couple that now takes the child they're like, well, this is our child but you have now separated that child from the only mother that this child has ever known, so that you can have your household that you want. So we'll see these kinds of infertility or these kind of fertility things also will come into play too when we talk about things like same-sex unions and how you have children in those unions are going to be oftentimes utilizing these techniques. Oops. Let's see. We're going to skip that. Let's see. So what really happens when one uses in vitro fertilization or surrogacy or these things is that one form of suffering ends up being replaced by another form of suffering. So it's not as though we escape all kinds of suffering. The internal suffering that parents may have from not being able to have a child is now replaced with a new kind of suffering when they realize that they've done something so heinous as to, we now have a child, but we've killed off all these other of our children, right? And that could be an even greater pain. And having to, it's important to recognize that, the child that you have through that has great dignity and worth, as do all the other children you brought into existence through that. It wasn't moral for you to do that because now you're faced with the fact that most of the children that you've produced either have already died or will die. And obviously too, like sometimes people with regard to abortion, sometimes they'll bring up the fact is like, well, if Christians are against abortion, then you also, what about miscarriages and things like that? They try to equate the two things, which are absolutely, utterly, completely different from each other, right? Yes, a child dies in both cases, but in the case of abortion, in the case of miscarriage, you're not responsible for their death, right? But in the case of abortion and these methods, you're responsible for their death, right? And so you can hear that sometimes in some of the so there's some wonderful quotes from the early feminists, like the first wave feminists that sought out women's right to vote. They were all against abortion, right? That used to be what they were like. Feminism was against abortion, not for abortion, as newer versions are today. And so, like, there's one really heartfelt. She's explaining. One woman is saying it's like, the pain of losing this child. She's like, and talking to like somebody else who's lost their child, who's died by other reasons, right? She's like, at least you don't have the pain, and she's struggling herself with abortion, having done abortion. She's like, at least you don't have the pain of being the one who's caused it, right? You're not responsible for the fact that your child died, whereas I have to carry the even great. Not only is my child dead, but I'm the one who caused it, right? So it just. So there are moral options. So obviously the use of adoption, foster care, and using forms of medical assistance that can help to achieve pregnancy, as long as it's assisting the union of husband and wife rather than replacing it. So let me see here. Yeah, so we've gone through so far. We've made it all the way to in vitro fertilization. The next step we'll be having to deal with and talk about same-sex relations. And we're close to the end of our time, so we probably should stop there, and we'll talk about, we've got in this area, we've got 3 more to talk about: same-sex attraction, same-sex marriage, and then we'll talk about transgender stuff. And look at that, because you can see how well, when we talk about transgender, those kinds of things, that a lot of principles in that area will apply to a lot of some of these other, things that occur in the area of sexuality. Because in each of these things, so you see on the side here, I say sexuality becomes about self-expression and no longer about unity between spouses and procreation. It's all about wanting to express myself, in the area of sexuality, and that's not what it's about. That's very self-centered. It's very selfish-centered, right? Whereas our sexuality is meant to take us out of ourselves. It's not meant. So whenever it's internally focused, that's when the danger arises, and it can so easily become immoral. But it's meant to take us outside of ourselves, right? And that's why too is like oftentimes if someone can be drawn into those kinds of things if they're lacking those kinds of healthy relationships, like we talked about with pornography, right? Pornography and really any kind of addiction often will be a replacement for real good relationships. I'm searching for some kind of love in some way. And in most cases, people that are utilizing a lot of these areas, they are searching for love. They're searching for something good, but they're just not finding the right thing. Just like we talked about when we talked about morality, is that we all want happiness, right? We all want good. No one actually purposely searches out things that are bad, things that will make them miserable, right? Even people who are seriously messed up and for some reason enjoy pain in some way or another, right? They still find some kind of pleasure within that, right? So they're searching for some kind of happiness, but they get the orders of happiness mixed up, right? They're settling for the first levels of happiness, for for this fairly short-term happiness, which means why they got to go back to it again and again and again with things like pornography, as opposed to the more difficult, but more longer-term happiness that real relationships with human beings and with God can provide. So, all right, I'll stop there for now. Yeah.